Hello, and welcome to the fourth webinar in City Parks Alliance's 2017 webinar series. I'm Catherine Nagel, the Executive Director of City Parks Alliance. Today's webinar will focus on how parks contribute to the resiliency of urban communities to help them adapt to changing conditions. We know that city parks are a form of infrastructure as they serve multiple civic functions, from filtering stormwater runoff to acting as transportation corridors and economic generators. They're also helping to lessen the impact of large-scale storms and other climate-related events, as much as we've seen recently. We'll first hear from researchers at Georgia Tech, who've been analyzing the economic impact that investment in multi-use infrastructure delivers in New Orleans post-Hurricane Katrina, and in Atlanta. And these are two cities that are part of a 12-city study on the economic benefits of U.S. infrastructure investments in collaboration with more than 50 university, industry, and government partners. We'll then hear from the Director of Community Projects at Pittsburgh Parks Conservancy, which has taken a very proactive systems approach to implement green infrastructure through small neighborhood park improvements. Through the Conservancy's efforts with multiple city agencies, they're addressing combined sewer overflows and flooding, while also improving connectivity and the ecological health of their community. We hope this webinar will help equip you to make the data-driven case for treating parks as multi-use urban infrastructure, while also understanding the large-scale opportunities and complexity of this work. Finally, this webinar is eligible for continuing education credits for landscape architects. If you requested credits, you'll be contacted after the webinar. Our first speakers are from Georgia Tech. Carrie Watkins is the Frederick Law Olmsted Associate Professor in the School of Civil and Environmental Engineering at Georgia Tech. Her teaching and research interests revolve around multimodal transportation planning and the use of technology in transportation. Prior to her doctoral studies, Professor Watkins worked for a decade as a senior transportation engineer at Wilbur Smith Associates in New Haven, Connecticut. She will be joined by Kevin Caravati, who is a senior research scientist and professional geologist at the Georgia Tech Research Institute, where he manages the Energy and Sustainability Group. Kevin has over 25 years of work experience and currently serves as a principal investigator for a wide range of energy, sustainability, and water resources projects for federal, state, and industry customers. He recently manages a team of Georgia Tech faculty and students, which is evaluating the potential impacts of infrastructure investments to create jobs, increase resilience, and accelerate economic development. Both Carrie and Kevin work to find practical solutions to everyday challenges and have been involved with projects that highlight green infrastructure's return on investment. They'll be followed by Heather Sage, who is the Director of Community Projects with the Pittsburgh Parks Conservancy. Heather runs Park Waters, a specialized unit within the nonprofit Pittsburgh Parks Conservancy. She's responsible for the development, planning, design, construction, monitoring, and maintenance of green infrastructure projects within Pittsburgh's city park system in collaboration with the Pittsburgh Water and Sewer Authority and the Allegheny County Sanitary Authority. After the presentations, we'll move into the Q&A session. We have a good crowd on today's call, and in order to make sure we can respond to everyone as questions or problems arise, here are some tips. In order to ask a question, please use your Ask a Question option. Simply type the question in the box and click Send. You may send us questions throughout the presentations, but we'll be holding them until the end. If you experience a technical problem during the presentation, please type it in the question box and send it to us. And if you missed something, don't worry. Download links to PDF and Windows media files of today's webinar will be emailed to all registrants, as will copies of any agreements and policy documents. So with that, let's get started.
Is that coming through?
Yes, you are.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. And the title for our presentation today, starting off, is Multi-Use Infrastructure, Resiliency in Action. And as Catherine alluded to, the needs and the importance of our infrastructure systems is just highly evident in everything we've been going through as a country the past couple of months. And our goal today is to really provide, and going forward, is to provide decision makers the data and the research that enables them to make smart infrastructure investment decisions. Parks play a vital role in the U.S. infrastructure, and what we're hoping to do is to work with legislators on the new infrastructure programs that are coming out of Washington, also at the state and the local levels, so that wise investment decisions can be made regarding infrastructure. Next, please. Parks, in our mind, are infrastructure. When we began our work back in 2009, our work was driven primarily due to the financial crisis and the resulting impacts to our cities from those problems. Today, we're looking at parks as infrastructure and the importance they play in vital areas including transportation, stormwater management, economic development, and public health. And through a strong collaboration of universities in multiple cities, a lot of local partners, the City Parks Alliance, Speedwell Foundation, and a whole host of folks in Washington, we've been able to put together we feel, a very strong backlog and a database that helps decision makers make good decisions and to strongly consider parks when they think about urban infrastructure. Green spaces serve multiple functions, and really what we've been able to show is that the combined impacts of these effects produce an economic benefit that can range from 2 to 7. With that, and that 2 to 7, that's pretty significant in terms of economic development and creating jobs for the communities that are affected by the parks and these systems. With that, I'm going to turn to Carrie, and she's going to discuss some of the problems that we see in urban areas as they relate to New Orleans and Atlanta.
Great, thanks, Kevin. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Oh, good.
Great. So as this slide talks about, some of the key problems that, as we all know, are happening in many cities across the U.S., but has been a very large problem in areas such as Houston, as we saw recently. Expanding urban areas are leading to lots of impervious surfaces, and this makes it difficult for the natural water flows to be draining. As that's disrupted by that urban sprawl pattern and all of these impervious surfaces, that stormwater that's been traditionally redirected into streams and lakes and rivers is going into storm drains instead, and when we have extreme flooding situations, it just can't handle it. Similarly, though, we actually have a big problem with traffic in many of these cities. So despite all of these impervious surfaces, we're losing a lot of time and money to being stuck in traffic. And the graphic that's shown in the bottom half of the slide makes this point a little bit better, that as we drive in very large vehicles with just one person in them, it takes up a lot of space. And so we need more and more impervious surfaces. And as we look to moving collectively or using modes that take up less space, we can be a little bit more efficient with how that space is used. So those are a couple of the problems that urban areas are facing. And what we're looking to do is explore how parks are actually overcoming those problems. Oops. There we go. So the idea with what we're looking at is that parks can utilize natural systems in order to process that stormwater, and at the same time they can serve as multi-use transportation corridors. So we can deal with surface runoff, discharge, the pollutant concentrations in that stormwater, and then we can also create mobility corridors to create a more active transportation network that uses less space on a per person basis, but also helps in the areas of health and just creating active lifestyles. So what we're doing at Georgia Tech, oops, I'm trying to click to the next slide, there we go. What we're doing at Georgia Tech, we looked at a number of parks across the nation, and we chose 12, 3 in each of the 4 primary areas that we're looking at: transportation, stormwater, economic development, and health. And today we only have time to go into 2 of those projects, but you can look forward to more information about all of them in the months to come. So to drill right down into the 2 that we want to talk about today, the first is the Lafitte Greenway in New Orleans. This was a park that was created after Katrina. There were funds available through the Disaster Community Development Block Grants, and then they paired that with the Recreational Trails Grants funding, and they created a 2.6-mile trail that connects the French Quarter with some neighborhoods outside of that where a lot of the employees of the French Quarter live. The trail was opened in 2015, and the whole park and trail, the entire thing, cost only $9.1 million. The whole project was developed in order to improve drainage in the area, enhance some of the street crossings. There was also an entire transit plan where they were improving the transit services in the area, creating better bus stops, creating places within the park that people could be active, and it's all built around a trail. So in the first year that it was open in 2016, the result of this trail was that it served more than 272,000 trips. And through our work, we actually went out on the trail and we were trying to assess whether it was being used primarily recreationally or primarily for transportation purposes. And it turned out that 80% of the people cycling on the trail on a weekday were doing so for transportation. So this is a trail that it's very much not just having those health benefits, but it's actually become a part of the transportation network, and it's helping people actively get from their neighborhoods into the center of New Orleans. And because of projects like this and the focus on trails that they've had post-Katrina, New Orleans has actually seen an increase of more than 260% in bike commuting. But then in addition to that, the park has numerous stormwater features. It's a beautiful park with 100% of the stormwater runoff that it creates being handled within the park itself and not having to rely on other locations. So then moving to our second case study city that we want to talk about, the historic Fourth Ward Park in Atlanta. This was opened in 2011. It's a 17-acre park, and it was funded by Tiger funds as well as some private development and city funds. It's a gorgeous park with a skate park and activity fields and theaters, and it connects to the Atlanta Beltline, which is a 22-mile corridor that's looping around the entire city of Atlanta when it's fully constructed about 10 years from now. This park connects directly to the first section of the Beltline that's already been open for a few years. And that again provides this alternative transportation corridor in addition to the stormwater features of the park. This one was a little bit more pricey than New Orleans. It was constructed for a total cost of $50 million. The impacts of historic Fourth Ward Park and the Beltline are immense, though. In the design of this park, what they had originally intended to do was create traditional stormwater pipes, the underground networks that we're all used to. And when they instead decided to create the park, they actually saved $16 million of the cost that it would have taken to create that pipe network instead. And so this park is designed to collect stormwater from 800 acres in the area. It's called the Clear Creek Watershed. And it can hold a stormwater event up to a 500-year flood. And it's actually very beautifully done that you can see the mark on the walls of where the 500-year flood is. And in addition to this, the connection to the Beltline, that trail serves 1.2 million trail users per year. And because of the beauty of this park and the accessibility that the trail has brought, we've seen $3 billion in commercial development in the area, 2,100 apartments, and it's literally Crane City as you bike along the corridor with so much development that's occurring with folks who want to be close to the trail and this type of park. So then the lessons to be learned from all of this is through parks as infrastructure, what we're really talking about is a new way to think about the critical infrastructure that we're constructing. Let's not think of parks as just parks, and let's not build infrastructure that only serves one purpose. If we're going to deal with these 21st century storms, we have to bring our infrastructure up to speed. So we need to be thinking through new ways of transportation for local residents that actually catalyze development as well. And we have to be thinking about how we can use those spaces for our stormwater purposes. And what's unique about these two parks in particular is they were using some unique funding sources that we have to be looking to more often in the creation of these types of spaces. So with that, I'm going to turn things back over. Thank you.
Great, and now we'll turn it over to Heather.
Thank you so much. This is Heather Sage speaking from Pittsburgh Parks Conservancy, and I'm really pleased to join the webinar today, so thanks so much to the City Parks Alliance for inviting us. I'd like to tell you a little bit about Pittsburgh's park system, some of the inequities that exist here, and how we as an organization have come to understand an expanded role that both we and our parks can play as integral parts of the city's infrastructure. We really look at green infrastructure from both a built and a natural perspective, and we're seeing the parks much more in the context of helping us solve critical regional water quality issues. The Parks Conservancy has been a partner to the City of Pittsburgh for about 21 years. We have completed 17 capital projects, and many of those have included green stormwater infrastructure. And we have had some experience with this over the years, but we are now really diving in and implementing this much more at a system-wide level. And as Catherine mentioned in the intro, we've actually gone so far as to create an internal unit called Park Waters, coming out of our strategic plan, where we've identified green infrastructure as both a strategy for our work as well as a strategy for funding parks here in Pittsburgh over the next foreseeable future, really. So this slide is just a background slide to give you a sense of how much Pittsburgh likes its parks. In the city's comprehensive plan process completed in 2013, people were asked, how important are parks to you? And about 95% of people said that parks were extremely or somewhat important to them. And their opinions grew even more favorable when asked whether neighborhood parks were important to their quality of life there in their own communities. Next slide, please. Can you go back one? Thank you. So here in Pittsburgh, we have about 160 parks covering 2,500 acres. Recently, there was a new acquisition that has not officially become a park yet, but when it does, it will add another 650 acres to the system. And within that, different parks are designated through the open space plan as either regional, community, or neighborhood scale parks. So amongst this wide array of parks, only 5, or soon to be 6, qualify as regional parks. Those are 200 acres or greater, and that has incredible significance for funding, which I'll get into in a moment. We also have over 20 community scale parks, which are multi-neighborhood serving and usually range in the size of about 5 to 85 acres or so. Next slide, thanks. So, not all parks are funded equally, and unfortunately there is a huge disparity between the level of service and maintenance that occurs within our park system, particularly from a capital project perspective. We have in Allegheny County a regional asset district tax which generates capital and operating revenue which parks qualify for, but only if they're over that 200-acre threshold. So as I said before, a very small percentage of parks here in Pittsburgh qualify for that annual fund. And in fact, that money is primarily used for operating support and not for capital at all. So most of this tax is going into funding people that are working within the park system, but not really improving the parks themselves. Those 21 community parks are not qualified to receive that funding, and then many, many dozens more neighborhood parks and playgrounds are suffering from decades of deferred maintenance and lack of capital investments. Next slide. So we really have begun to view green infrastructure as a catalyst. More than 10 years ago, of course, state and federal clean water mandates required that Pittsburgh, along with many other cities around the country, pay close attention to reducing our water quality impacts through combined sewer overflows and to find strategies to better manage our stormwater. So the sanitary authority here went about planning an infrastructure improvements plan, which was a gray-only approach. Since that time, there's been a political shift, which really occurred through the advocacy of a network of groups through the Clean Rivers campaign at an organization called Pittsburgh United, which has helped to inspire the leadership in the region to make a shift and look at adaptive management approaches and green infrastructure as a first strategy rather than a sidelong strategy. So this slide shows you that the shift has actually gone so far in the political thinking that now the Pittsburgh Water and Sewer Authority, which released its Green First citywide stormwater assessment, or its plan for how it wants to meet these mandates late last year, has identified that 80% of our critical water issues are lying within 20% of our sewer sheds. And these same issues that are causing the combined sewer overflows are also leading to localized flooding, leading to water quality problems at the more local level, and are overloading the system. So investing in green infrastructure is going to allow for us to solve a lot of problems at once. And I'm sorry, I don't seem to have control of the slides, but you've gone ahead of me. So could you back up just a smidge? Thank you so much. Here on this slide, we see that Pittsburgh has, we have taken the parks and overlain them with those priority sewer sheds that I was describing. And it's pretty easy to see that there's a lot of overlap there. In the blue, the light blue areas, these are the top 7 most critical sewer sheds where cleanups and strategies need to be implemented. Then the lavender area are the sort of next 20 down. And within those areas, next slide please, we have been actively working over the past 4 and 5 years to create both master plans as well as more detailed designs for stormwater management that link community priorities for their parks and for their neighborhoods to the kinds of metrics and controls that our sewer and water authorities need to be meeting to meet their water quality standards. We see this as the opportunity for us to direct funding and maintenance into some of these smaller community and neighborhood parks where there have been no resources before, and to give us opportunities to maintain those assets over time, since the mandates will require that our agencies will have to keep these systems in good working order. Next slide, please. So I'm going to dive in quickly to two case studies. One is the 4 Mile Run area, which is a sewer shed level strategy. Just to give you some context, this is within Pittsburgh's Schenley Park. It's one of the 5 regional parks that I described. It's over several hundred acres in size. And as you can see in the slides on the left, when it rains, there is significant flooding at the bottom of the watershed, and in many cases, very dangerous conditions because, as you can see in the slide, in the image on the right, the red areas are the existing sewer piping infrastructure, which all converge at one point below the park and are actually bypassing the park itself. So very little water is coming into the natural system within the park, and instead is backing up through the piping system into manholes and into people's basements throughout the lower portion of these neighborhoods. Next slide. So we've been working in Schenley Park for more than 15 years, and before we ever had the sense of the context that we were working in, we had identified a number of critical objectives, both from a connectivity perspective as well as from an ecological restoration perspective. And so when we began to see how we could work at a scale that went beyond the park itself and into the neighborhoods, we saw that green infrastructure could be an avenue for solving those regional problems I described, as well as the park issues that we needed to address. Next slide. So the plan that we are in the preliminary phase of at this point actually would allow for the redirection of stormwater from the surrounding densely populated neighborhoods and university districts into the park itself, using an existing lake, as well as recreating a stream channel in the valley that you can kind of see outlined in blue, all the way down to the Monongahela River, which is at the very bottom left of your screen. And this would completely separate a significant amount of the stormwater that's going into the combined system from that system altogether. We're estimating that at least 120 million gallons of water annually will come out of the system, which equates to about 32 million gallons in reduction annually of a combined sewer overflow at the discharge point. And this work also includes mobility corridors, as we'll be reclaiming this underutilized section of the park within the stream valley and allowing for people to move between the neighborhoods in through the park and into the system more efficiently. The project is estimated to cost about $25 million and will have an enormous amount of collateral benefits, including flood reduction, recreational value, and increased property values in the region. Next slide. Now I'm going to talk about one of the smaller parks in our system. This is McKinley Park. It is one of the community parks, and it's one of the oldest parks in Pittsburgh. This is a project that we were fortunate enough to receive funding through the National Recreation and Park Association's Great Urban Parks funding opportunity, and we leveraged that into additional funding from the Sewer and Water Authority and the Sanitary Authority. The work began in this park about 4 years ago as we created and completed with the community a master plan, aware of the fact that this was one of the critical sewer sheds in the region, and that we wanted this master plan to combine stormwater management priorities with the kinds of community needs that the neighbors were identifying. So the project will help to reduce combined sewer overflows. It will also help to reduce flooding and help to meet total maximum daily load goals for Sawmill Run watershed, or Sawmill Run stream itself, which sits at the base of the watershed. Additionally, the project, which is going into construction this year, will include accessible pathways, will connect to a residential and business district greenway, will open up a section of the park that has been unused for decades, and will allow for the connected green stormwater system within the park to really begin. This is sort of a first phase of a much bigger set of connected projects within the park. Next slide. So we really see that it's critical to integrate design work for an adaptive management approach. And the way that we are approaching this is first, as I said, really understanding the context that we're working in beyond the park scale and looking at how key watersheds can help us leverage both activity and resources and funding. Doing a technical and feasibility analysis that really helps us understand where this work will be most impactful, using community engagement to refine these conceptual designs, and advancing preliminary designs for stormwater management. And from that point, we can then add in new layers and priorities, such as transportation. And of course, quantifying those primary and collateral benefits is key in order to keep things moving. We're hoping that this model of our work can be used system-wide. Next. And so last but not least, we're still learning lessons with each new project and with each new effort. But some of the lessons that we are learning are that it's important for us to be proactive and adaptive versus being reactive. And this requires that we make an investment as an organization to be in the community, to be at the decision-making table with the city and with outside agencies that may in the past have seemed kind of unrelated to our work. We're learning that our urban parks are part of an overall urban planning scheme and that we need to blur the boundaries. And our work has now started to expand beyond the park boundaries. We're learning that taking a system-level approach can help lead to much larger opportunities, and that we can get creative about leveraging funding that may not have seemed like it was initially appropriate for a park, but more appropriate for infrastructure, and how we can blend those two together. Another lesson that we're learning is that other people's problems can become our problems in a good way, and that we need to be a partner in addition to seeking new partners. So again, sometimes being at the table and offering our hands can lead to new opportunities for us. And last but not least, of course, we are learning that urban parks are the key to resilient infrastructure here in Pittsburgh. Thanks.
Great. Well, those were wonderful presentations and very rich, and great to see the analysis at kind of a higher level, and then really see how this is playing out on the ground with the great work that the Pittsburgh Parks Conservancy is doing. So Heather, I have a few questions for you. One is, can you tell us a little bit about the Park Waters unit within your organization? How many people work in that unit? When did you start it? How, I'm thinking about other organizations that might be listening in. Is there a model you're developing that could be adopted in other cities?
Sure, great question. We have about half a dozen people in the group, and we call it an internal management unit because not all of those people actually directly report to me or to even the same supervisors, but because of their skill sets and experiences, they bring something very distinctly important to this work. So, for example, we have a landscape architect, we have a senior restoration ecologist, we have our parks curator who really is able to blend the historical context with design elements in this work. And then we have expertise from the horticulture and forestry side of our work to really help us implement good designs that we can maintain and that we can use their skills on the ground to help guide volunteers with that maintenance and so forth. So it's really kind of from the beginning to the end of the cycle. We try to have a team member that can help along each step of the way and bring some of that expertise into the work that we're doing.
Thank you. And just a reminder to our participants, if you'd like to ask a question, please use your Ask a Question option. And you just simply type the question in the box and then click Send. And we want to make sure that we're sharing any questions you have with the panelists. Another question is around maintenance. And as these park projects are complex and you have more agency partners, can you talk a little bit about how that works? Who takes the lead? How do you figure out the sort of the operational and maintenance aspects of it? Can you tell us a little bit about the realities of working within such a complex structure?
Yeah, it is complex, and what we're experiencing is that the departments that the city has relied upon for maintenance in the past are not necessarily ready to take on some of this new infrastructure because it is a little bit more hands-on on a regular basis than in a lot of the smaller parks they've been used to because the resources have been so limited. So in Pittsburgh, the Water and Sewer Authority is looking to take on the control or the responsibility for maintenance of green stormwater infrastructure that relates directly to their mandated compliance. And we're also partnering with a lot of organizations around the city that are doing workforce development and green jobs training within their neighborhoods to, kind of ready the workforce at a neighborhood scale and ensure that there are people who have these certified green stormwater maintenance capacity to do the work. But some of the challenge is the legal authority to sort of hand that maintenance over to them. So in Pittsburgh, we have a very strong union system. The unionized workforce is hard at work at the Department of Public Works here in the city, which maintains parks. So some of this is, kind of being thought through and being worked out as we speak, and we don't have all the answers yet, but it is certainly a challenge. We've taken heart at how other cities have been able to make this work and figure it out, places like Kansas City and Philadelphia. So we're hoping that within the next couple of years, the answer to this question is a lot less convoluted and pretty straightforward.
Thank you. And we've got some good questions coming in. First one is, can you speak to, and this is to all the panelists, to the reuse of waters collected within these infrastructure improvements?
Yeah, I was waiting to see if Heather was going to jump in. This is Carrie.
Go ahead, Carrie.
Okay. What we're seeing with the number of the parks that we're looking at is there are more and more functions being built in to actually reuse the water, especially within the park itself, for like the irrigation purposes and such, but all the way down to not just collecting that stormwater, but some of the parks are even doing reuse of the facilities on site, that they reuse their water so that like in the restrooms and things like that. I'm more of a transportation than a water expert, so I wish I could go into more detail about that, but if the person asking the question wants us to put them in contact with somebody, I'm happy to do so.
This is Kevin. I was going to say a lot of the sites that we've worked with, they've already had strong reuse practices put in place, and what the introduction of or an expansion of a park in these areas, it allows them to just improve their collection and their reuse practices. It expands them, and they maybe provide more even greater benefits. For example, here in Atlanta in Piedmont Park, they reuse a lot of it, but they've also a lot of the captured wastewater is diverted, and so and overall stormwater and surface water management, that's where we see a lot of the improvements there too.
Yeah, in Pittsburgh, we have, of course, been looking very closely at how we can both use and reuse the water that's collected in these systems. So a couple of different examples. In the same Schenley Park that I was describing before, we completed a project about 2 years ago where there had been, for many decades, a small pond that was a water feature within a memorial. And the pond had been supplied through a water system and was, sort of going back out the other end, so needed a constant supply. The redesign of the system to allow for capture of stormwater has allowed for that base flow to really stay in the water feature and for it to kind of be reused rather than us having to pipe fresh water into the system constantly. Another situation at the environmental center at Frick Park that the Parc Conservancy rebuilt in conjunction with the city. This project is a living building and therefore it's zero net water. And so we've actually incorporated a lot of really inventive strategies, including capturing all the water that falls on solar panels that overlay the parking area, and as Kevin was describing, reuse a lot of that quote-unquote gray water in the gray water systems throughout the building and throughout the campus of the site, and are also using it for irrigation on the site and for watering throughout. So there are lots of different strategies where we're putting the water to use in a reuse fashion, and then in a lot of the park's designs that we're beginning to build now, it's more about putting the water back into the forest, putting the water back into a stream, kind of understanding what the capacity of the natural system can handle and augmenting that in some way so that we're preserving as much of that or enhancing as much of that as we can, but bringing more water into the places where it belongs.
Great.
Just to add what Heather said, we see in a lot of areas where they're taking up concrete. Even on our campus here at Tech, we're restoring areas that have been paved over or have piping system. We're restoring them to natural systems, and that's been very effective.
So the next question is, are there precedents for creating enterprise funds for parks like other infrastructure systems such as water and sewer? Those similar to what those systems have.
Catherine, you and your team may have some good examples. And do we have a little bit of clarification on what's meant by enterprise, what they mean by that, and how that may differ from traditional funding streams for either through clean water revolving funds or so forth?
Yeah, I think anything that's that's working to generate some new sources of revenue for these projects beyond the typical municipal budgets.
Well, I think many people are familiar with the tax allocation district type incremental financing programs that are in place. One that we heard we liked was basically a common area maintenance fee that could be tacked onto new developments, and these are for urban areas, not so much rural, but common area maintenance fees tacked on to apartment complexes or condominium complexes, things like that. Now, it's going to take some arm twisting of the development community to get them to agree to that, but that is a path forward that we see in terms of funding there. And locally, what we're seeing is the philanthropic community come together and establish funding for low-income areas to help turn those around. And what they want to do is fund jobs, provide job training with the idea that people can work in new parks that are being constructed going forward. And I think that's one of the more creative things that we've seen. in terms of it's indirect park financing, but it's bringing jobs and funding to the people directly impacted by the creation of a new park in their community. So I think that's one of the more entrepreneurial or enterprise-oriented funding mechanisms that we've seen. Again, it's philanthropic primarily. Some of it's being matched by the city or the counties, but we hope that model will continue.
So this is Carrie. If I could jump in a little bit on that one too, Catherine. There's obviously two different funding needs. There's the construction of the parks in the first place, and then there's the maintenance of them longer term. And with the 12 sites we've been looking at, with the construction of them in the first place, like I was talking about, there's been some unique things done in terms of using transportation funds because they're constructing a multi-use trail, and if it can be shown that this is really serving that transportation purpose, it opens those funds up to those projects. And then again, with the Lafitte Greenway, it was disaster recovery funds. So some unique pots of money for the initial construction. And then we're seeing a lot of these parks using their conservancies, and they include some sort of an element where there's, you know, places to hold events, you know, either ongoing events where it's once a year, that type of thing, or weddings and those sort of more personal events. And the income that's coming from those, they use in the maintenance of the park.
Heather, can you talk a little bit about the pay for success model?
Sure. Yes, there is not yet a successful implemented project here in Pittsburgh, but we know of, thanks to City Parks Alliance at the conference this summer and through work that's been happening in the DC area and other places around the country, that private financial dollars can be invested into systems like this where a very tangible social impact, or in this case, environmental impact, is able to be measured and able to be demonstrated. And so in the case here in Pittsburgh, we're looking very closely at how the Water and Sewer Authority or the Sanitary Authority, who are under an obligation to do this work, could potentially move faster by having a capital pool from an outside investment group that comes in and provides that capital and allows for things to be both monitored and measured along the way. And if the goals are met or exceeded, the investors are paid out at a minimal or an even higher level than they had anticipated. And of course, the agency is kind of farther along in its goals. What we're looking at here in Pittsburgh is how we can integrate the design costs into that model as well, so that we can kind of have almost a revolving fund where patient capital comes in, whether that's through the philanthropic community or this investment community or some combination of the two, and sort of the low-hanging fruit projects can get done, but design can begin on additional projects simultaneously, so that there is a sort of a constant pipeline of a series of projects taking place. So hopefully we'll have more to report on that in the next 6 to 8 months.
Great. I know there's been a question. Go ahead.
Catherine, I was just going to say real quick, on the U.S. infrastructure side, that's one of the bills, or one of the ideas that's being kicked around, is the repatriation of corporate profits. In other words, profits that have been earned overseas by companies being brought back to the states, and then a portion of that allocated for bond financing for infrastructure programs. And in the discussions, parks and wastewater and bridges and roads and health and communications technologies are all part of that package. So if the current administration moves forward with that and has the support, that's one of the more positive things that I think that we've seen going forward as it relates to U.S. infrastructure and parks. More positive in quite some time. So it's it's a large chunk of money that they're talking about. Whether they can make it happen, well, we'll have to see.
Right. And we're going to be following any kind of infrastructure legislation here at City Parks Alliance. There was a question about the designers of all of these projects, and what I'd like to do is to send that information out to everybody after the webinar so that you know whose creativity contributed to all this great work. I think the final question I'd like to ask is, how do we educate the public about these important issues, going beyond those who are involved, like landscape architects, city planners, ecologists, etc.? Heather, do you want to kick that off?
Sure. I think the partnerships piece of this, we hear about this all the time, but it's really true. As I mentioned early in my presentation, part of the political landscape and the political will for this in Pittsburgh was opened up by a collaborative called the Clean Rivers Campaign. And this effort really has brought together people of all stripes, and they have the religious community very actively involved, low-income community groups that are focused on a wide array of social justice issues are involved, as well as sort of more traditional environmental organizations and the business community, because here they were recognizing that the costs, the say $2 to $4 billion investments that would happen via traditional gray infrastructure, will be the type of work that frankly wouldn't be felt or seen by very many people. It would be in the form of giant underground drop shafts and tunnels that would cost a lot and perhaps effectively deal with the issues, but wouldn't be felt or seen and wouldn't provide any tangible neighborhood community benefits, and would certainly be burdening ratepayers without them having a connection to what their money was going to. So I think part of the answer is really broadening the tent and looking at how these issues impact different types of stakeholders in very different ways, and how we can connect into their needs and their issues. And that's why the designs need to be very integrated and very inclusive. And I think that's why, as Carrie was saying, that also opens up a lot of avenues for creative funding.
Great. Carrie or Kevin, do you want to add anything to that?
Carrie, you want to go ahead?
Well, to me, the answer to the question as an educator is that we have to do some education in the public. We have to make sure that we're ensuring that they understand where the funding for these things comes from, and the impact of choices that are made in the design of our infrastructure systems. And so, at risk of making a segue you weren't looking for, I would actually say things like the video series that City Parks Alliance is putting out, where it talks about all of this, our ability to get that out and get the word out to the public using things like those videos, I think is key to making sure they understand how critical this is.
And I would just add that the unfortunate events that hit Houston and that hopefully are not going to impact other parts of the country in the next week or so are just powerful reminders of the importance of building sound and resilient infrastructure. And the Buffalo Bayou system in Houston, Harris County, has shown to be one of the most effective areas for managing stormwater to the extent that they could. However, it wasn't enough, and they didn't have enough of those. And I think what people are going back to the board is to look at it and say, how much more land needs to be dedicated to conservation and parks and recreation purposes, as opposed to concrete and impervious development surfaces. So the current events, I think, are just powerful drivers, and then getting the message out that parks are infrastructure with this amongst all of us is very important.
Great. Well, due to time constraints, that was our last question, and I'd like to thank our panelists for joining us today. This is an incredible set of speakers and such a new area of exploration. So I know that the panelists have graciously offered to answer questions beyond those that were answered during the webinar. So if your question was not addressed, be sure to reach out to these folks so that you get the information that you need. And as Carrie said, we've been working on a video series, and I want to make sure that you stick around until the very end of this webinar for an exclusive sneak peek at the brand new video series that we've created on parks infrastructure. You also will be sent a download link for a copy of today's presentation, and then copies of agreements and case studies referenced in the webinar will be made available on our Parc Exchange resource library. For those of you who haven't discovered Parc Exchange on our website, visit cityparksalliance.org to get access to a host of documents, agreements, and MOUs to help you better understand best practices and partnership agreements. Access to this database is a great and exclusive benefit of CPA membership. And if you enjoyed this webinar and you're not a member, be sure to join City Parks Alliance for more content like this. This is the first session in a short webinar series on how parks function as infrastructure, born out of our recent Greater and Greener conference, where we received many requests for programming on this topic. Of course, today we focused on neighborhood level resiliency, and in future sessions we'll cover an array of other topics like health and climate change adaptation. So be sure to check out our website to keep up to date. As we mentioned, many of you who were at the Greater and Greener conference saw a compilation of our City Parks America's new infrastructure video series. That was the overview, and we have 4 more coming, focused on health, transportation, resilience, and the economic benefits of city parks. As I mentioned, we've taken just a little clip from the video on parks and transportation that features the Lafitte Greenway that you've just heard about from the Georgia Tech research. So we want to play that for you.
Those things. Before Katrina, there were about 10 miles of bike lanes in the whole city. When the Greenway opened in 2015, it included the 100th mile of bike lanes. So there's been an incredible investment in bike infrastructure. 1 in 30 New Orleanians uses a bike to get to work. That's the 6th highest bike commuting among large U.S. cities.
Something innovative about the 606 and the Lafitte Greenway is that these 2 parks were really built as transportation infrastructure, and not just for biking and walking. They were built with a specific purpose of connecting to the rest of the transportation network in the city. So they're built along transit lines. They're connected to different train stations or bus stops within those cities.
If we can make an area safe for walking and biking, it gives people transportation choices. And it also helps the city achieve some of its equity goals to make sure that we have a transportation network that's not completely focused around automobiles, which not everyone can drive, not everyone can afford to own. So we want to have a system that is equitable and provides choices to people.
There will always be environmental benefits to parks, but what we're really seeing is the social benefit, the economic benefit, and the community development benefit.
Cities in the future are going to rethink that 40% of that public realm that was overplanned and overprogrammed for cars, and will start sharing in a very different way. I believe there's going to be this huge evolution with parks, public spaces, and the change of the public realm leading the way.
Great. So we'll be releasing these videos throughout the fall, and be on the lookout. And we are creating them so that you can use these locally, and we'll be, of course, sending you information about how all of that will happen. I'd like to thank all of you, our participants, for helping to make this webinar series a success. Please take a minute to fill out the very short evaluation we'll be emailing you. We'd appreciate your feedback and any suggestions you have about how we can improve our webinars. And finally, thank you for all the great work that you're doing out there in our urban parks. Keep it up.